Detective Gotyounow and the Case of the Missing Watch. One sunny morning, Detective Gotyounow received an urgent phone call. It was Mrs. Clark, the owner of a small bakery in a rural part of town. She sounded worried. Detective Gotyounow, I need your help, she exclaimed. My grandmother's watch has disappeared from the bakery. It's very special to me. Detective Gotyounow grabbed his notebook and hurried through the busy streets to the bakery. When he arrived, Mrs. Clark greeted him, looking upset. Where did you last see your watch? Detective Gotyounow asked, his eyes carefully scanning the bakery. I left it right here, Mrs. Clark said, pointing to the counter near the cash register. I only walked away for a few minutes, and when I came back, it was gone. I've searched through the shelves and clothes in the storage area, but it's nowhere. Detective Gotyounow noticed a dusting of flour on the counter and a tiny footprint nearby. He took out his notebook and jotted down his first clue. Footprint near the counter. Detective Gotyounow turned to Peter, the baker, who was busy arranging fresh loaves of bread. Peter, did you see Mrs. Clark's watch this morning? He asked. Peter scratched his head. Yes, I saw it when I arrived, but then I went to the kitchen to prepare the bread. I didn't see it again after that. Gotyounow nodded, writing down his second clue. Peter was in the kitchen. Then Detective Gotyounow noticed the back door was slightly open. He walked over and discovered a small piece of cloth near the door. Mrs. Clark, who was standing nearby, mentioned, "It must be from the clothes delivery that arrived last week." We had regular supplies delivered that day. Gotyounow carefully took the piece of cloth and wrote down his third clue. Cloth found at the back door. Detective Gotyounow decided to question Jenny, the delivery driver. "Jenny, were you here this morning?" "Yes, Detective," Jenny replied. "I left the boxes by the back door and didn't go near the counter. I was on a tight schedule and needed to get to my next delivery quickly." Detective Gotyounow made a note about Jenny's schedule and her usual route through the area. He then looked over his clues. Footprint near the counter. Peter was in the kitchen. Cloth found at the back door. Jenny's tight schedule. He thought deeply. Then he turned to Mrs. Clark and asked, "Do you have a cat here in the bakery?" "Yes," Mrs. Clark replied, smiling a little. "Her name is Muffin. She loves to jump on the counter and play with anything she finds." Detective Gotyounows' face brightened. "I think I've solved the mystery. Muffin probably found your watch and knocked it down." "It might be hiding somewhere on the floor." He bent down to look under a shelf, and there it was. Mrs. Clark's watch, safe and sound. Everyone laughed with relief as Mrs. Clark picked it up, grateful to have it back. Detective Gotyounow tipped his hat with a smile. Sometimes the smallest clues lead to the biggest answers.